One, two, one, two. 1, 2, 3, 4.
When do you want me to zoom in?
When you
Because I think now they can see everything here and here, and why zooming?
clearly
To see the screen.
or when the screen is too bright and doesn't change nothing new and the person speaks in speech.
Okay.
So it's just a matter of taste, I think. Maybe it goes with the change.
Oh, okay.
And yesterday the screen stopped to work. It was working in the beginning.
Yeah, I understand. Okay.
So we already had two downloads.
Ah,
That's Luba, the person in Russia.
yeah. It's nice that the people can see it.
The two viewers are
Outside, behind. I thought that already somebody is joining, but it's not. I didn't see that they're the people from the behind.
well, but we have to start different people.
Да. Hello. Well, Am I really getting?
Think is it possible to move
To move back?
forward?
Well, I can.
Increase the
Okay, let's try.
size of the picture.
I think
Because this is not
no,
network.
that's not possible. Uh, I don't know your name, but sorry, can be tell. Do you think it's possible to put this table on the stage so we can stand there behind
That
it?
was my original suggestion. I think you think that's the way to do it?
Yeah, because the people cannot see him now. They come and see.
Can you see him now?
Yeah, it's a little bit better. Like now he's
The slides are difficult to see because it's like
well, but that's not possible to be. Otherwise, I should stand and hold the camera, you know. And usually, you should have bigger piece, yeah, in order to be in front. So
I think the problem is this presentation.
So we have scarcity of chairs, and those who don't have chairs can exceptionally take them from the restaurant area. Please bring them back to the restaurant area. So if you want a chair, please bring it from the restaurant area and return it after the lecture. Thank you.
Yeah, she's networking. This is so
Yeah.
It's very short. I can't go backward. I can see you right here. A little bit more. Yeah, I think it's better. Yeah, I think a little bit, just a little bit. Yeah, I think it's okay now. Yeah. Okay, yeah, it's you. I'm following you.
So welcome to this evening lecture. My special welcome to all the viewers around the world who are invited to join our event here at Global Inspiration Conference, and my thanks to Luba Bogdanova from Russia, who built up this connection and who is the mother of this project. Thank you. So I hand over to Wolfgang.
Welcome to our second keynote speech. Two of our distinguished keynote speakers are part of the Science and Research Group of the IBF. One of them is Wilfried, and the other one is Peter Litchfield. And I'm very happy to have him here today. And for me, this is a very special accomplishment this group was able to achieve, to get involved, Peter Litchfield in the IBF and in the CHIC. And I'm very curious. I experienced him as a very enthusiastic and a very convincing speaker in the workshop he was just giving. And without any further ado, I hand over to Peter. A warm welcome. And we're all, I suppose we are all very curious about your talk.
Thank you, Wolf. And Wolf is a new dear friend that I made while I've been here. So that was worth it just for that. To come here. Yeah, okay, I'll try to keep this up where I need it. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I just finished a workshop with maybe 40 of you, something like that, and it was a great experience. I really enjoyed working with those of you who were there, and I look forward to making this short presentation here this evening. We have a lot of material to cover, so I need to be careful of what I do here. I have a lot in these slides. If you'd like a copy of these slides, you're welcome to write to me and I'll send them to you, a PDF copy. And that's the email where you can reach me, where it says education@bp.edu. And there's one other email I'll also give you. Wilfried, I was wondering, You were going to get me a different microphone, or?
No, it doesn't.
Oh, okay, all right, I just have to make sure I keep this here.
Yeah.
I'm not used to using a microphone. I'm usually very loud when I speak, and it's never an issue. So this is a little different for me. I'm from the Graduate School of Behavioral Health Sciences. We formed the school about 5 years ago, and it's a university. It's a licensed university in the United States. And what we do is we bring together behavioral science and physiology in different fields. One of our schools is the school. Hold on a second. This didn't quite work. Hold on a second. Just a second. This pointer is doing some that was strange. Okay, here we go. All right. One of our schools is the School of Breathing Sciences, and this is how we got started. And we offer a master's degree. It's the only one of its kind anywhere in the world, as far as we know, a true master's degree in breathing sciences. And it's an integration, again, of behavioral science with physiology. And we have the master's degree in applied breathing sciences that we offer to all kinds of people, ranging from athletic coaches to general physicians. And they get engaged in this to bring breathing work into their practices. So we help people bring breathing work into what they're already doing as a professional. And then we have a couple of certification programs. The second one down is a certified breathing behavior analyst. I'm going to move over here. I'll stand over here. Like this is better?
Yeah, it's better now.
It's that I tend to move around a lot. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. And our certified breathing behavior analyst program is to prepare healthcare providers and many other kinds of professionals, like opera singers that we work with, to bring this breathing work into what they do. And it's really the foundation for our master's program. So if somebody goes through that program and they're really interested in going much further, they can do the master's degree program. And we also qualify people that way, and we invite them into our master's degree program. Anyway, again, if you want to contact me personally about anything, you can do so at education@bp.edu. This is the mission of the School of Breathing Sciences. It's to help people improve health and performance, and that includes consciousness, of course, through the application of what we call behavioral learning principles to respiratory physiology, or breathing physiology, which is really the topic of my presentation here today. This is just a description of these certification program I'm not going to go into here, but it is here. If you have a copy of the slides, you can essentially read about that program. We also have a brochure that you can look at. So here's what I'm going to be talking about today: aligning breathing mechanics with respiratory chemistry. So most of my discussion will be about physiology, but from a psychological perspective. First thing I want to introduce to you is a basic equation, just right at the start, so there isn't any confusion about what the subject matter is going to be about. This equation is called the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. You can see here, which we call the HH equation. Any pulmonary physiologist knows this equation. Any pulmonary doctor knows this equation. Any acid-base physiologist knows this equation. Any respiratory therapist knows this equation. It's a fundamental equation that you can read about in any textbook. Okay, and it's about pH regulation. A lot of people believe that we regulate our pH through the foods we eat, things like that, where people drink alkaline water and they avoid certain meat and things like that. In reality, pH is controlled through the breath. pH is controlled from moment to moment through the way you're breathing. So you have very profound effects on the body without realizing it. all the time throughout the day. And we're going to go into what that's about. So looking a little further into this equation, you can see that it has a numerator and a denominator. The numerator is bicarbonate concentration, that HCO3 minus, that's a bicarbonate ion. And then the brackets around it indicate concentration. So that's bicarbonate concentration, for example, in the plasma of the blood, divided by the concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood. That gives you your pH. And it's not just the pH in your blood, it's the pH in the cerebral spinal fluid, it's the pH in the interstitial fluids that surround the cells in your body, and it's lymph fluid. That pH is regulated from moment to moment to moment by the way that you are breathing. Okay, now the bicarbonates are regulated by the kidneys. It's regulated by the kidneys. And basically yes. That's a little hard for me. I don't think it's possible. He wants me to slow down. That's impossible. Okay. I've been an adventurer all my life. I like adventure and excitement. That's where I've been all of my life. Relaxation has not been much a part of my life. Yes. Well, right here you have your base, which is your bicarbonate ion. And your carbonic acid is the acid side of it. The CO2 forms carbonic acid. So that your pH is a function of the bicarbonate concentration and the CO2 concentration is what it is.
Yeah, I have bicarbonates and the other scientific word, but there's one stand for acid, the other one for base.
I'm sorry?
You don't hear the question.
Yeah, they can't hear you.
I just wanted to know if the denominator.
The numerator.
The numerator refers to acid and base, or.
Yeah, the numerator is base. Yes, yes. Okay. So the bicarbonates are regulated by the kidney and the kidneys. And what happens is, as the blood is filtered in the kidneys, the bicarbonates move into the nephron of the kidney. Each kidney has about 1 million nephrons. And so what happens is the blood is filtered. The bicarbonates go into the filtrate in this nephron in the kidney. And then the body reabsorbs that bicarbonate. So the kidney plays a role in getting the bicarbonates back into your blood. And the kidney also manufactures new bicarbonate. Okay, because if you're buffering acids like sulfuric acid and phosphoric acid because you're metabolizing proteins, you will lose a certain amount of the bicarbonates in your system, and they have to be regenerated, and they're regenerated by the kidney. Dysfunctional breathing gets in the way of that. Dysfunctional breathing will prevent the manufacturing or the regeneration of those bicarbonates. And also, the return of the bicarbonates to the blood is controlled by carbon dioxide. And what a lot of people do is which we'll get into in detail in a moment, is they overventilate and they lose carbon dioxide. And when you lose that carbon dioxide, you ultimately, in the long run, lose these bicarbonates and you can get into trouble. But we'll come to that later. In any event, the bicarbonates are controlled by the kidney, and it takes a long time. It takes up to 5 days for the kidney to make whatever adjustments they can make.
Breathe.
No, 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 no. No, thank you. You breathe. No, I don't want to breathe like that. How many of you believe that people walk around under breathing? Any of you believe that there are just lots of people out there under breathing? It's very unusual that people under breathe. Breath holding doesn't lead to under breathing. Breath holding doesn't really have any effect on oxygen concentration. Okay, what's common is overbreathing, where you lose too much carbon dioxide. And in any event, we'll come to that a little bit later. But looking at this equation here, you see that the kidney is regulating the bicarbonate. And the CO2 is regulated by what? By you, by your breathing. You regulate the CO2. And there are reflex mechanisms in the body, in the brainstem, that normally, if you allow those reflexes to work, will regulate the CO2 level exactly correctly. So your pH is maintained perfectly in the system if you allow the reflexes to work. Those reflexes in the brainstem operate on the basis of the pH level of the blood in the aorta and in the carotid arteries. And those receptor sites detect the pH, and that information is sent to these centers in the brainstem, these respiratory centers. Also, the pH of the cerebral spinal fluid is measured by those receptor sites in the brainstem. And so breathing is being regulated by pH all the time. Not only the pH, but the level of carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide level in the carotid arteries and the aorta, and the carbon dioxide level in the cerebral spinal fluid, again, will regulate your breathing. And it's regulated through the diaphragm and through the external intercostal muscles. And it's a reflex. And then also, of course, oxygen concentration. And it's the oxygen concentration in the aorta and in the carotid arteries. There are receptor sites that detect that and send that information to the brainstem. So if you allow the system to work on its own without getting in the way, the pH will be regulated perfectly. The problem is that people get in the way. They learn breathing habits that disrupt the regulation of carbon dioxide. Either there's too much carbon dioxide or too little. I see the word slow, but that isn't really something I know how to do. I understand. It's no, thank you. I like my help. So, in any event, you see, my way of being in the world is to be excited and involved in what I do, and I find that is what's led me to be my age at 76 and still do all the things I do in my life is through my involvement and my energy. Yes, but you know, it's probably have a foreign language in the situation that complicates things. But I'll try to speak more slowly. Only get through half the material. But you know. Okay, so the CO2 is regulated by your breathing habits and by the brainstem mechanisms. Those are the two things, and your breathing habits need to operate in concert with the reflexes. They need to work together. If they don't work together, you get into trouble fast, as you'll see. Okay, so we talk about this equation as the chemical axis of the breath. And the idea is you want to have a stable CO2 level no matter what you're doing. Whether you're excited, you're bored, you're running, you're aerobic, not anaerobic, but you're aerobic, you're going to sleep at night, you're eating, you're talking, you're communicating, you feel good, you feel bad, you feel sick, whatever it is, that CO2 level needs to be stable. That's what we call the chemical axis of the breath. So if I'm breathing fast, or I'm breathing slow, I'm breathing deeply, I'm breathing in a shallow way, I'm breathing through my mouth, I'm breathing through my nose, whatever I'm doing, you want that CO2 level to be stable. That's called the chemical axis. Like when I'm talking, I can be breathing fast, I can be breathing slow, I can take deep breaths, small breaths, I can breathe rhythmically, dysrhythmically, my breathing's changing all over the place, but you know what? My chemical axis is stable. How do I know it's stable? I can feel it. I can feel it. My experience of it. And I know it's exactly the way I want it to be. And it's automatic, because I'm allowing those reflex mechanisms to work, even though I'm talking and I'm changing my breathing in so many different ways. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about, is aligning your breathing mechanics with the chemistry. And of course, sometimes, as we know, I'll talk about briefly, is we move the chemistry to what might be considered a dysfunctional chemistry, but it can be very useful. We do lots of things. We challenge our bodies all the time. So challenging our bodies from a breathing perspective isn't necessarily a bad thing at all. It's only when it's out of your control that you get into trouble. So basically, you can see the bottom here. It says acid-base balance is equal to bicarbonate concentration divided by breathing behavior. Okay, here are some of the more general things I would like you to go away with here. I better stay in front of this because I move away from the mic when I do that. First of all, to really understand breathing physiology, I'm a physiologist. To really understand breathing physiology, you have to know breathing psychology. You can't understand what's going on unless you know about breathing psychology. Breathing physiology by itself isn't nearly as exciting as looking at the interaction between breathing, the psychology of breathing, with the physiology of breathing. It's much more practical to look at both things. So that said, I would just like to mention to you that we think of physiology as a system that learns habits, that all of physiology is learning habits all the time. That basically physiology finds solutions to problems. Those solutions are habits. That physiology is smart, that it's intelligent, that it's motivated, that it does things based on the outcomes of what it does. That physiology acquires information, it saves information, we call that memory. And the physiology uses that information, it organizes that information, it's called perception. And then when it changes the way it functions, we call that a learned behavior. So physiology is a psychological phenomenon. And physiology, from our perspective, is psychological. It's not about psychology influencing the physiology. It's that the breathing physiology is psychological by its very essence. And that's fundamental to the work that we do. So let's see if there's anything else here that I have on this list. I think I've pretty much covered it except for two things, and that is that when we work with people, we do an assessment, we do an evaluation of someone's breathing behavior when we work with them, and we use what we call behavioral analysis. Behavioral analysis is a huge field in the field of psychology. So we bring that to respiratory physiology. And then when we help people who have dysfunctional breathing habits, we use behavior modification or behavior therapy, which is also a large part, a very large field in psychology. So here's a few things I'd like you to remember, is that, first of all, what behavioral science is about, it's about how physiology reconfigures itself through learning. That's what we call behavioral physiology is about. That physiology reconfigures itself through learning. And that here are a few things to remember. To think behavior, not just physiology. To think breathing behavior and habits, not just breathing. To think physiological learning, not just personal control. The physiology is learning, it's not just you. To think self-regulation and not just self-intervention. Self-intervention is extremely important, but self-regulation is another level of consideration altogether. Okay, a few quotes I would like to read to you, which I rarely do in a presentation, but these are quotes that, for something I prepared for you, an article that I wrote for your newsletter, and there's 3 quotes out of there that I would like to read to you, and then move from there into in some serious depth into the physiology. And it says here, breathing and its potential effects on our lives, positive and negative, are enormous. We all agree on that. Appreciating this enormity is significantly enhanced by learning about the amazing physiology of breathing, which you're going to start learning here in a moment, which together with understanding breathing as motivated behavior, that breathing is motivated behavior, that can account for the profound and far-reaching effects of breathing on health and performance. Okay, then the next quote I would like you to hear, again, it's written for you in that article, but it summarizes what I'm going to be talking about very well. It says, millions of people from around the world include breathing learning interventions in one way or another in their professional and or personal lives for lots of different reasons. Most of them, however, focus on the mechanics of breathing without even so much as a thought about its chemistry. That is the role of mechanics in optimizing what we call internal respiration or chemistry, respiratory chemistry. So they're working with mechanics, but they don't have any sense of how it's affecting the chemistry inside. And that's unfortunate, because there's so much more that we can do if you are aware of that relationship. This is the last quote I'm going to read to you. It says, this is the most important one. It says the relationship between breathing and respiration, there are two different things. Breathing and respiration are not the same thing. They're quite different because we breathe for many reasons, not just for air, not just to get oxygen. We breathe, for example, to talk. We breathe to escape bad memories, for example. Because if we take large breaths and we lose too much carbon dioxide, that will cause the blood vessels in your brain to constrict. And then you lose access to memory when you do that. So someone may breathe the way they do to escape a memory, for example. So breathing serves many purposes. It's not just about pH and delivering oxygen and so on. It's really much more exciting than that. So going on here, it says a relationship between breathing and respiration, mechanics and chemistry cannot be fully appreciated without understanding the psychological nature of physiology itself. Breathing, like any other behavior, is motivated and changes as a function of its outcomes. Breathing isn't simply mindless automation of physiology, and it isn't simply physiology to be somehow consciously manipulated in the name of self-help. It's truly so much more than this. Simply manipulating breathing physiology for well-intended purposes without regard to the bigger picture does not do justice to the richness and the complexity of breathing. And that's really the point of my presentation here tonight, is to try to, maybe for some of you, expand your idea of how breathing is really involved in health and performance, much more so than perhaps you thought of or considered. These are some other considerations here. The first one is about how common dysfunctional breathing is. It's estimated that 25% of the United States population suffers with dysfunctional breathing. 25%. Learned dysfunctional breathing. Learned dysfunctional habits that they have no awareness of. And they go to see the doctor with a symptom, and the doctor gives them a prescription of some kind. And the effects of the dysfunctional breathing habit aren't recognized. They're attributed to something completely unrelated. And so the symptoms are treated and the causes are not looked at, they're not considered, okay? And this is routinely, I can't tell you how common this is and what a problem this is, where these symptoms get attributed to something else. So it's a major worldwide problem that, you know, there's 220 of us in this group, and there's probably 80 million Americans suffering with dysfunctional breathing problems. There's not much, you know, is 220 people that we can do to help all those people. If you look at breathing problems around the world, it's immense. We need a lot of people to get involved in what breathing is about, to really address the problem.
And you also give example of dysfunctional breathing pattern.
I will.
Okay.
Okay, now here's a quote from a psychoanalyst. And he's a very famous psychoanalyst. He's no longer with us, he's passed on. And he says that every mental health professional, whether they're a social worker, or a psychiatrist, or a psychologist, or a drug counselor, or whatever it is, they all should do an evaluation of breathing before they start their work. That's what this psychoanalyst said. And there's a lot of people who agree with that. Here's a quote from a colleague of mine who says that maybe 1 out of 100 of his patients don't have a dysfunctional breathing problem. 1 out of 100. In patient populations like in pain management and pain patients, almost 100% of pain patients have dysfunctional breathing problems. And no one's doing anything about it. Very few of them get any help. The real problem here is that habits aren't recognized. They aren't recognized. And the reason is because people don't think of breathing as a behavior. They just think it's a piece of physiology. Just a piece of physiology. It's not a behavior. If you understand it as behavior, then you talk about motivation. Then you talk about learning. Then you talk about attention. Then you talk about perception. And then you talk about personal history. Talk about personal learning histories. So I'm just going to move ahead here, and here's a case history. I'll mention to you briefly. I'm going to mention a few case histories as we move into the physiology. This is a woman who is a Buteco worker. A Buteco worker? You know what Buteco is? Most people know about Buteco. It's all about the exhale and about carbon dioxide. Okay? This woman is a breath worker, but a Buteco worker, and she has been a Buteco worker for 10 years. And as it turned out, she had a serious dysfunctional breathing problem around carbon dioxide. She was losing too much carbon dioxide and she was in trouble and had all kinds of symptoms. And her Buteco techniques what they're normally used for is to teach people to maintain good levels of carbon dioxide. But even though she was an expert on the subject and had been a therapist for 10 years, she had this carbon dioxide problem. The reason she had the problem is because the Buteco technique didn't address her habit. She had a habit around the inhale. She had problems, but she'd learned to breathe in a certain way when she inhaled, so that when she did her Buteco technique, it had no effect on her problem because the Buteco technique was unrelated to what the habit was all about. So what's very important in this work is that you identify specific habits that people are suffering with and address the elements of those habits, or you're unlikely to help a person through a problem. Let me give some other examples a little bit later when we get through some of the physiology. Okay, what is a dysfunctional habit? It's something that compromises physiology, or it compromises psychology, or it compromises performance. And one of the things that's really important to understand, this is really so important, I really want you to get this, is we don't define a way of breathing as just because it's something that historically is maybe had some bad reputation. We don't call that dysfunctional breathing. Like fast breathing is not dysfunctional. There's nothing wrong with fast breathing by itself. Slow breathing, there's nothing wrong with that by itself. Deep breathing by itself, there's nothing wrong with that. Shallow breathing, generally there's nothing wrong with that either. Breathing in the chest is not necessarily anything wrong with that. Or breathing in the diaphragm, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. Or breathing through the mouth or breathing through the nose, they're not necessarily problems. And let me show you here in this next slide. Here's a slide. The upper graph that you see there is carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide is too low. It's very low. It's extremely low, okay? And this person is breathing at 6 breaths per minute. And their breathing is rhythmic, nice and rhythmic, nice and even, breathing in the diaphragm, slow, deep breathing. But this breathing is completely dysfunctional. This breathing is no good. It is really compromising this person's physiology seriously because the carbon dioxide level is too low. So just because it's slow doesn't mean it's good. Just because it's diaphragmatic doesn't mean it's good. Just because it's through the nose doesn't mean it's good. You don't know whether it's good without exploring it further. Now here's another, whoops. Here's another graph of someone breathing at 3.5 breaths per minute. 3.5 breaths per minute. And they're losing too much carbon dioxide. This is dysfunctional breathing. This is meditational breathing rate, but the breathing's dysfunctional because of the effect on the physiology that you'll see in detail in a moment. Yeah, okay. Here's somebody who's breathing very fast at 27 breaths per minute. And this breathing is good. This is really great breathing. Really good. The CO2 levels are perfect. The chemical axis is just where it should be. I'd have to ask you, what's wrong with that? I don't see anything wrong with that. Maybe there is something else that we haven't considered because I don't know the whole case of this particular person. But the fact that it's fast doesn't make it bad. You have to be able to demonstrate that it's dysfunctional. So, is there a clock or something I can look at? I need to monitor my time. A watch or a clock or something?
About the door.
Okay, all right. Let me say this, and I'm going to jump straight into the physiology here, is that a dysfunctional habit can be the primary cause of major symptoms and deficits, and you'll see why in a moment. It can trigger symptoms brought on by other disorders, like it could trigger epilepsy, it could trigger an angina attack, it could trigger a panic attack, it can trigger all kinds of things because you change the chemistry of the body so significantly that it can cause an organic problem to raise its ugly head. So you get all the symptoms that otherwise wouldn't have been there, like you might have an epileptic seizure that you wouldn't have otherwise had. So a dysfunctional breathing habit can play a major role in triggering an organic symptom. And then also it can exacerbate a symptom. Say during pregnancy, someone feels nauseous and they essentially breathe in a particular way where they lose too much carbon dioxide and the chemical axis is out of whack. The chemical axis has gone wrong, and that can essentially make the nausea worse, or it can bring on nausea where it might not have been there otherwise. So breathing can interact with these organic situations in very significant kinds of ways. So I'm going to move right into looking at some of the physiology here. We'll just go ahead to these slides. First of all, looking at respiration, there are 3 different phases to respiration. One is external respiration, which is the mechanics that you all know. And then there's internal respiration, which is the chemical axis. That is the chemistry of breathing. And then there's the cellular respiration that we all know about. So you can get, even though respiration is reflex oriented, it's mostly a reflex, the respiratory side of things. Learning still gets involved, and I'll give you an example of this. I was working with a nurse, and this is a case I went over in my workshop. This is a nurse who had a gasping problem. She had asthma, and she was gasping all the time, okay? And she had a prescription for gasping to try to reduce the gasping. And then she had a prescription for the prescription because she had side effects from the first drug. So she had another drug to control the side effects. And then I looked at her breathing and I could see when she was still gasping, because with the instrument we use, the CO2 instrument we use, you can see gasping. And I could see the gasping. And she was still gasping even though she was medicated. And then I took some earplugs, and she took these little pieces of wax, and they put the pieces of wax one in each ear, so she could hear her breathing. She could hear her breathing. And as soon as she could hear her breathing, within 1 minute, 30 seconds to 1 minute, all of her gasping stopped. Gasping is gone by putting wax in your ears. She took the wax out of her ears and she was gasping again. This is a habit. Okay, and she said to me she was amazed because she thought her gasping was because of her asthma. And she realized that putting wax in her ears wasn't going to cure her asthma. And taking the wax back out wasn't going to bring the asthma back. She realized that her gasping had nothing to do with her asthma. However, she wasn't completely right, because the reason that she learned it was because she had the asthma. She had the asthma and she learned to do the gasping. So you get this interaction between these organic kinds of problems and the learning and the breathing. So we don't have time to go through this, but it's here. If you get a copy of the slides, here's the cell respiration. It gives you kind of a diagram of how cellular respiration works, about how the ATP molecules are created within cells. And we don't have time to go through that, but it's here. It's important that you understand those are the three phases of respiration. You have the external respiration, which is moving the gases into your lungs and back out again. Breathing deeply, breathing shallow, breathing fast, breathing slow. These are the mechanics. This is the external respiration. And then the internal respiration, where you move the carbon dioxide from the cells back to the lungs. Then you distribute the carbon dioxide properly in the system, and so on. So it's about the chemistry of the breathing, and this is the cellular respiration here. So let's just jump directly into, well, one other slide I want to show you quickly is right here. You can see here that this is a physiotherapist who was demonstrating good breathing to us, to myself and the supervisor of this physiotherapist. And she was showing us what she teaches her patients. And so she was breathing. You can see here, you can count 6 breaths. That's a 1 minute screen. So she's breathing at 6 breaths per minute. Okay, and it's nice and rhythmic breathing, and she's breathing in her diaphragm. But notice her CO2 levels below that red line there. So she's overventilating, so her breathing is dysfunctional. But you can also see this other graph, the blue one here. This is the muscle activity here. And this is I'm recording the muscle activity in her face. I have a placement of EMG in her forehead. So while she's breathing, she's tightening all the muscles in her face. Every time she takes a breath, she tightens the muscles in her face. So she was demonstrating really good breathing, she thought, by breathing slowly and deeply and diaphragmatically. And she's disturbed her body chemistry radically by having these low CO2 levels, and she's contracting her muscles with every breath in her face. And she's developing a major headache. And she's developing that headache because she's got less oxygen going to her brain, less blood sugar going to her brain, and because she's contracting these muscles with every single breath. And this, according to her, was perfect breathing. And this is what she teaches to her clients. All right. So let's jump into the chemistry. And think it went too far. Hold on a second. Oh, maybe I did. Let me just check to be sure. Okay, I'm just going to go forward. Okay, here we are. These are some of the effects of getting rid of too much carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is precious to your body. You need carbon dioxide. You would be dead without it. And you need just the right amount of it at all times. And if you don't have it, you get into trouble very quickly. And here is a list of things that will happen to you if you lose too much of it. Let's take a brief look at it. Number one, the subject of oxygen. Everyone knows hemoglobin carries oxygen, right? Well, if you lose too much carbon dioxide, the hemoglobin will not deliver the oxygen properly. It will hold on to the oxygen, and it won't give it to the tissues that need it as easily. So you are compromising the delivery of oxygen by taking breaths that are too large. And even though you've got lots of oxygen, it's not getting to where it's supposed to get. Secondly, hemoglobin releases nitric oxide. And nitric oxide controls blood vessels when they open and they close. They dilate and they constrict. So if you release nitric oxide into a blood vessel, it will dilate. But if you overventilate, which is the most common dysfunctional breathing problem there is in the world, and you lose too much carbon dioxide, that nitric oxide will not be released, and you'll get vasoconstriction. The blood vessels will constrict, thereby reducing blood flow, for example, to the brain or to the heart. And this happens in seconds. This is not days or hours, this is seconds. Then another factor is that when there's too little CO2 in the blood, and the blood becomes too alkaline, that will also cause the blood vessels to close. They'll close up on you. And again, you then restrict the delivery of oxygen and the delivery of blood sugar. And that can be extreme, where you see cerebral hypoxia, it says there, that can be extreme, where an area of the brain can actually be damaged as a result of CO2 levels that are too low, and the blood flow is so restricted that potentially you can have tissue death, tissue damage as a result. Another consideration there is that the cells in your brain, for example, when you lower the CO2 levels down too far, what you will get is you'll get acidosis in the cells. You get lactic acidosis in the neurons in your brain. So it's no wonder when people will overventilate, for example, they'll start crying, you get all kinds of emotional shifts and so on, because the brain simply cannot function normally. So depending on the stage you set, when you start to overventilate, if you set a positive stage, you can get a positive outcome. But if you set a negative stage, you can get very negative outcomes. So the context in which you do, for example, something like holotropic breathing is very important, because if it's a poor context and a bad environment, then you can get the triggering of all kinds of negative things. Sorry? I'm sorry. It's not used to this. Sorry about that. Anyway, there are all kinds of things here that happen. Another one is sodium deficiency that you can develop, potassium deficiency. You can get a bicarbonate deficiency. A bicarbonate is something you use to buffer out lactic acid and keto acids in your body. And in essence, as a result of overventilation, you can lose those bicarbonates and suffer with issues surrounding fatigue, for example. There's just a major list there, but one thing that's important to understand, this is the negative side. There's the positive side of this. That is, if you breathe well, you can move in the other direction. So you can improve your ability to learn, You can improve your ability to pay attention. You can do all kinds of really amazing things by addressing this chemistry. This is the negative side of the chemistry. And this is where I work most of my time, is on the negative side, although I also work with peak performance athletes to work on the positive side. Some examples of this kind of thing, some simple cases of what happens with people. A case I mentioned in the course here, we were working with a lawyer who was trying to pass an exam, trying to pass the bar exam, trying to get licensed as a lawyer, just come through law school, and he couldn't pass the test. So we looked at his breathing and everything looked perfect. But when we took a sample test, that you can buy in a bookstore, get a sample test so you can practice taking the exam, and we gave him the book to look at with the sample questions, and he immediately started to overventilate, he started to lose carbon dioxide, and when he read the questions, he couldn't remember anything he read. He couldn't remember nothing. Okay, so we realized that this overventilation and all these physiological changes were occurring as soon as he looked at this exam book. So we taught him to take control of it so that he could lower the carbon dioxide levels on purpose, and then he could bring them back to normal. He could bring the carbon dioxide level back to normal, so when he was taking the test, he could feel when he was starting to overventilate, starting to lose CO2, and then he could immediately reverse it, and he passed the exam without any problem at all, because he had good blood flow to his brain. So you can do, major things to help people around learning and around performance, around if you can address this fundamental chemistry. Then, yeah.
Maybe just say to everybody, how did you teach them this? Mike, please.
Go ahead,
Just
Lauren.
tell them how you got him to low in your
Yeah, well, that's what I was trying to say. She's saying, how did I get him, how did we work him through this? So we have him sitting there, and what he does is he practices taking larger breaths, a little bit larger, a little bit faster, and the CO2 level will start coming down. And then when he gets it down, he knows, he understands how he brought it down, he understands how he got it down, and then he learns to bring it back up. Because if you know how to do it, if you know how to lower the CO2 level, then you know how to bring it back up. So it's called negative practice, where you practice doing it, and then you practice coming back. So when we put the exam down in front of him, and he started to lose carbon dioxide, he knew how to stop it and bring it back to normal. So that when he went to take the test with the state, he could regulate his CO2 level, regulate his breathing while he was doing the exam, and he could remember what he was reading so he could answer the questions. It was very simple in his case, what we had to do.
Still,
Yeah.
On what basis? Just further from the question that's just been asked. I don't know if you can hear me. Oh, that's better. Just further from the question that was just asked. What did you do with this person to improve his situation? And you said to make large breaths. And hearing you that all breaths were good. So on what grounds?
All breaths can be good or bad.
Larger breaths.
All breaths
situation.
All breaths can be good or bad. In his case, it was not good because he was losing carbon dioxide. So whatever he was doing, it wasn't good because he was losing the carbon dioxide. And what we wanted to do is he needed to become familiar with what he was doing so he could not do it. So you practice doing it and then you practice stopping it. So you have control over it. So when he went in to take the test, he wasn't breathing that way so he could remember what he was doing.
So it's about bringing awareness to the situation rather than a technique of breath.
It's more than awareness because it's a skill that he had to develop to be able to do it.
Peter, I think what he's looking for is control of their
Am I not answering your question?
So I took a course with Peter, so I'm just trying to coax him because you guys are all breath workers and you want to know, well, how do we do this, right? So Peter, what I think would be really helpful is when you were working with me, slow, sorry. When you were working with me and we wanted to raise the CO2, a lot of times we would shallow the breath, correct? Can you please explain that? Because that will be helpful.
It's not, my intent here was to get through the physiology, but if you want to know about that, that was just simply an example of a dysfunctional habit this person had and how very easily we were able to bring him out of it. What you actually do for a person to learn to essentially restore that CO2 level is quite different from one person to the next as to how you actually do it. The first thing, the person learns how they did it. And very often the way that people have learned to do it with a bad habit they have is they start taking these large breaths and they get into trouble. So in his case, I had him do what he does, and he could feel, and he had the awareness, as you say, that he was taking these larger breaths. And he could see and he could feel that change in his brain as he was doing it, where he couldn't focus anymore. He couldn't focus, and he could feel that. So when he got down there, he realized the way he had to get back was by taking very small breaths, very gentle breaths, so he could work the CO2 level slowly back up to normal. And he would practice that. So he had control over it. So when he got in to take the exam, and he found himself taking these larger breaths, he immediately would disengage it and start taking these small, gentle breaths so the CO2 would come back up again. And then he developed a confidence in that, so he could go in and take the examination and do well. But what's important here is the physiology of it, which has to do with the way he was breathing was dysfunctional because it was producing that radical vasoconstriction in his brain, so he wasn't getting the blood sugar and the oxygen he needed to function normally. And he had a misconception about breathing where he thought the larger breaths were good, and in fact that's what was getting him into trouble.
Peter?
Yes?
Surely the reason the lawyer changed his breath physiology is because of his emotional reaction to the idea of the exam. So isn't the breathing a symptom, not a cause?
No. No.
No?
Not at all. No, the opposite.
But usually exams make people nervous.
This is really a good example of, and I know him, you know, he's been a friend over the years, we're acquaintances. He doesn't get what it's about.
I think I do.
Okay? So, for instance, I'll give you a good example, since we're not continuing the physiology at the moment. Here's a good example. Somebody, it's exactly what he's talking about. Someone gets headaches when they get stressed. Okay, so you give them some kind of intervention to deal with a headache, some kind of stress management, or maybe diaphragmatic breathing or whatever to try to relax them to deal with a headache. But in this example, you're just addressing the symptom. You're not addressing the cause. In this example, and I see this so much of the time, this person has learned when they feel stressful to overventilate. That's a dysfunctional habit. The stress has control over this habit. The person learns to respond to the stress by taking these larger breaths or whatever that person is doing. The problem is the learned behavior to the stress. It's not the stress that's the problem. Stress is in our lives all the time. There's no reason why you should get a headache because you're stressed. And in this individual who has learned to breathe dysfunctionally when they feel stressed, the CO2 level drops, oxygen supply to the brain stops, or not stops, but goes way down, blood sugar in the brain goes down, and now the headache starts to develop as a function of the lowering of the oxygen and glucose supply to the brain. The problem is the habit. It's not the stress. It's the learned response to the stress that is the issue. So what we do, if that were the case, and in many cases, many times that is the case, where what we do is we address the breathing habit, not the stress, because the stress, in most cases, is going to be there anyway. Now, doing stress management is a good thing. No one's saying that stress management isn't a good thing. But what's important in solving the problem for this person is to address the cause of the problem, which is a dysfunctional habit that is triggered by the stress. It's a learned reaction to the stress. That's what we do every day, all the time, all of us who are doing this work. So that is so invariably the case where the stress gets blamed. The person is a victim of the stress. We don't approach it that way. You're not a victim like this gentleman. I keep focusing on him. You're not the victim of the stress, but you're a victim of your own behavior that you've learned in response to the stress. That's the message.
Yes.
Mark, was that,
yeah, Mr. Peter.
did that address your issue, Mark? No, we do this all the time.
Yeah.
We see this all the time.
Your belief is that a perfectly adjusted individual or a well-adjusted individual learns to reduce the number of circumstances in which he feels stress.
No.
So
no.
many of the lawyer students in that guy's class went into the exam without needing your intervention.
Of course not, because they didn't learn to overventilate when in that stressful situation.
Well, for some of us, the exam won't be stressful.
Yeah, but the point here is that people learn habits to triggers. And stress can be a trigger. Lots of people, when they get highly stressed, their breathing, their chemical axis is completely normal. Totally normal. There's no reason why the chemical axis should go bad because you're stressed. You were built to be an adaptive organism that when you're stressed, you can breathe properly. And so the chemical axis is stable for most people when they're stressed. Lots of people, however, when they get stressed, they engage in a learned dysfunctional kind of breathing. And you work with them to overcome it, so when they get stressed, they no longer overventilate and can't focus, for example, on answering the exam questions. So it's about understanding breathing as a behavior and how it gets learned in response to a particular situation. And this is what our whole master's program is about. Yeah.
Okay, we have somehow sneaked into the discussion already. I wanted to ask you, Peter, before, is there anything you want to say to come to a final conclusion with your presentation? And then we start with collecting questions. It seems that we don't have so much time left, but I want to give you the time to come to an end with your presentation and say what you think is most important for you to finish your presentation, and then we will see how much time we have left for your questions.
Okay, let's just move then to some of these symptoms. I'll get to your questions in just a moment. These are some symptoms that you see with low CO2 levels. It's a whole list here. It's just amazing the symptoms that can come about through dysfunctional breathing. And again, I want to point out to you, you can get the opposite through doing good breathing. This is just the negative side. And that's what we deal with all the time. People come in with these dysfunctional habits. And these are the kinds of things that we see. For example, altitude illness. I've worked, because I live at high altitude. I've worked with people with altitude illness. There was one couple where they were breaking up, and the man was moving to California, and the woman was staying in Santa Fe at the high elevation. And as far as anyone was concerned, he had altitude illness and he couldn't live there. But what we found out is that what he was doing, he was overventilating. Because overventilation, or the low CO2 levels, is the primary variable in altitude illness. That is the primary variable in altitude illness, or low carbon dioxide levels. So we worked with him and got his carbon dioxide levels back up at 2,200 meters, and he didn't have to move away. So it just plays a role in so many different things, whether it's in pain management, whether it's in asthma. It's just a huge list here. One thing I might mention as the last thing is that breathing is also very much like a drug, where in essence people, by taking a drug, change the brain state, and then they like who they are. When they're in that brain state, they have better self-esteem, they like the way they talk, they like the way they think, and they prefer to be there rather than being without the drug. The same thing can happen with breathing, exactly the same thing, where you can essentially change the CO2 level and then change the chemistry in the brain, and you're in an altered state, and it can be a place where you like to be. You see this in trauma a lot. People who have trauma will go there, lower their CO2 levels so they can avoid emotions, they can avoid feelings, they can avoid thoughts, and so on. So it can play a major role in self-esteem, all kinds of things. So there's a real, amazing physiological foundation for these things. And what I urge you to do as a conclusion here is that you acquaint yourself with the chemical axis of the breath, and then you understand that the mechanics, and the chemistry need to work together. And if you're doing the mechanics independently of the chemistry, you're not going to do nearly as much as you could for your client otherwise. I mean, it's just the most powerful piece of the breathing is the chemistry part. That is the power of it. The mechanics serve the chemistry. So to do breathing work just focusing on the mechanics is to miss a huge part of the picture. Very important part of the picture. So anyway, there were questions. Thank you, people.
Okay, let's only have 5 minutes for discussion and a lot of time for private discussion during lunch afterwards, during dinner afterwards. So we are going to collect. Please wait for the microphone. We have a very important question.
Peter, thank you very much for your presentation, for all those research. I've been always asking myself, what is the origin of our emotions and how it is generated? Now you give me an answer that the increasing of nitric acids in our body create a kind of, restrictions. And here is the question. While we are breathing, the moment when we start crying or expressing anger, etc., is it just an expression, a result of nitric acid increasing in our body? This is one. And second, when those emotion is related to certain memories, do we think, do you mean that those increasing in nitric oxide is stored on the level of the memory cell?
Well, this way
because it is linked with certain events and trauma.
Okay, you are asking a lot of really good questions there. There's a lot of considerations in all of that because breathing is interacting with so many of these other things that are going on, and we have to tease that out. We have to figure out how the breathing is wrapped in with those things. When it comes to the nitric oxide that I'm talking about, it's a nitric oxide that is released by the hemoglobin. The hemoglobin transports it and then releases it. When there's adequate carbon dioxide, it will release it. And then you get the vasoconstriction, vasodilation, and then you get the supply of the blood to the surrounding cells that allows them to function normally, given the metabolism of those cells is now up because the emotion may be occurring in that particular place, and you need the blood there, and that nitric oxide is making it possible for that blood to get there. And the carbon dioxide is regulating the release of that nitric oxide as well as the oxygen.
Okay, we have space for the final
really
question.
Important, great questions. This is a discussion. It's not really a simple answer.
Yeah. Okay, we have a final question here in the first.
Thank you. It's a bit confusing for me because if I'm thinking in the context of being a breath worker and I have a client, and you say this client shows some of the symptoms that you lined up here, and it could be the result of a good breathing, and it could be a result of a bad breathing. Or
if you're getting these symptoms, then the breathing is dysfunctional by definition, unless you want the symptoms.
But you also said it could be an effect of a good breathing.
Well, the good breathing is where you don't have the symptoms, where you can actually improve blood flow, for example.
Okay.
And so by improving blood flow, you can improve function.
So how can I practically, as a breath worker, without any instruments,
Yes, that's a natural question.
help my clients get into good breathing?
There's a real good answer to that. What she's asking is that, how can you do this work without an instrument?
Yeah.
Okay, and that has to do with awareness training, so that you learn, you can work with your client around their breath where the symptoms come on and the symptoms disappear. You can't see the CO2 level, but you can see the symptoms come and the symptoms go. Like, for instance, I was working with a young woman here earlier today in the workshop, and she had all kinds of blurry eyes, dizziness, all kinds of things that would happen. So she could tell that her chemistry was out of alignment by as soon as she could feel that dizziness, for example. And we collect that information. We have forms that we use. And you fill out those forms, and you see the symptoms, you see the frequency of the symptoms, you see where they experience the symptoms, and you have all the information about the symptoms, and then you can work with your client in essentially having them overventilate somewhat to get the symptoms and then back off of it where the symptoms go away. You can work with your client without an instrument. You just have the symptoms to look at, you don't have an instrument to see it.
I hope very much you do another workshop, so it will be. I will come and.
We didn't come to the one we did?
No,
Yeah. We had a great
I
time.
would really
Yeah.
appreciate another one.
Yeah, you can do it without an instrument.
Thank you.
On Wednesday, I'm going to Israel for a couple of days, but I'm coming back on Wednesday. So I could do it Wednesday afternoon.
Yes. Yes.
Do another one, I could do it today. Yeah.
So thank you for your question and the vivid discussion. Thank you, Peter. It's time for dinner. Enjoy the dinner, and we see each other tomorrow for the next meeting.
Please,